So this is the second installment of the liquor cabinet build. Obviously compared to the last intro, this is now starting to be painted. I need second coat on some of this, and the drawer boxes I haven't really even started painting, but this is going to be the color. It's a Sherwin-Williams color called, I believe, Foggy Days. And it's going to look a little different on video, but in real life it's kind of a grayish blue. I actually really like the color. I prefer painting things colors versus painting things white, which is what usually ends up happening. So it was a nice surprise to get an actual color for the finished cabinet. The top still isn't done. The top is either going to be painted like the rest of the cabinet, or it's going to be a cherry top that's clear coated to kind of contrast with the base, and the customer's deciding on that. So once that's done, I'll do the top. So the main portion of this video is going to detail making the drawer boxes. I believe I show you how I finished up the center wine bottle partitions, as well as a bulk of it will show you how I made the base. And then the third video will show the door making and kind of pulling all the rest of these elements together. There was a lot of different elements in this build, so all three videos are going to kind of span all over the place with what they're detailing, but that's the basic gist of it. This is almost done. Also, like I said in the original intro, which kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say caused a stir on the YouTube channel, but people commented on it a lot, was that I transport these things on the top of my car. I've been strapping plywood to the roof of my car for probably 7 years. I've never had an issue with it. On bigger builds, I will rent a truck. A lot of the built-ins I do are a little bit further away, so I rent vehicles. But for stuff like this, she lives 5 minutes down the road. It's really easy to just put it on the roof. I've never had any sort of close calls or anything like that. I'm not against trucks or anything like that. They're just pretty expensive, and I'm actually going to be in the market soon for buying a truck because my car is older, and I'd rather replace it before it dies. But for the time being, it gets the job done, and that's kind of the motto of this shop. So that's what I got going on. So to start on the base, I got a couple 2x4s, and I'm going to cut them up and then rip them down so the curved edges aren't there, and they're it's a cleaner look with the flat sides. They'll also be straighter. These 2x4s usually have a crown in them, so ripping them down on the table saw will get rid of that. For projects where pieces are going to be painted, I usually use a nicer grade of 2x4 or 2x6, which you can find in certain big box stores. There's really no point in making something like this out of nice hardwood lumber if it's just going to be painted. These are also 2x4s, so they're very structural. They're made to hold up the walls in your home, so they could hold up a cabinet. So I just put a 14-degree cut on the bottom edge of these. This I did by eye. There wasn't any sort of science to it. I've done this before, and I did about the same sort of angle. And then I could transfer that angle to my sliding miter gauge on the table saw and make repetitive cuts using the stop you can see there. So this is lined up against the stop, can make cuts, and since these little blocks are parallelograms, I don't have to flip the board or anything like that. I could just make 4 cuts to get my 4 legs. The base is 6 inches tall, so I'm cutting these so they're 6 inches tall. I'm going to lap these together with my long runners. Lap joints are not the prettiest joint, but they're one of the strongest. So once again, since this is going to be painted, that's what I chose to do. So I made the marks of where I should cut these and where the lap should go, just based off of referencing them off of the material. I like the idea of laps here because they're pretty easy to cut. And with these feet and the weight of the cabinet, if you don't have a strong joint there, can eventually start to split and come apart from the base. Since there's going to be a lap joint glued in place there, it's almost physically impossible for these legs to kick out over time because they're stuck underneath of that runner now. If you just screw these into place, I think down the line you'd have an issue. So to start the laps, I'm just using the tenoning jig on my table saw. Since it's at an angle, I clamped it in place, and I'm just cutting halfway through this piece, basically half the thickness of the piece, and then I'll be able to make another cut to remove the bulk of that waste. Sometimes I make these cuts using curved cuts on the radial arm saw, but for this I use the tenoning jig. And you could see that the long rails fit in my shop just barely, so I was able to cut those as well in the same way. So then to remove the pieces, I'm using an attachment I have for my crosscut sled. I could get everything set up once again with a stop and then just remove that excess. And so this is 2 cuts making this joint. Now on the feet, I cut them all identical, which means for the long runners, I'm going to be cutting the lap on one side and then the lap on the other in order to make it work. That's just the way that it works out here. You can see one side, so I'm not making that joint on both sides because I cut the feet all the same way. If you cut the feet 2 of them with the different angle, you wouldn't have to do this. So either way, you're changing the cuts. I decided to change the cuts on the long pieces. So you see, it was pretty easy to remove that material. I could do the same for the other one. For this one, I just eyed it. I didn't bother setting up the stop or anything like that. And then those are my pieces. The legs fit in there perfectly, and you could see what I mean by now. Once this is glued together and upside down, those legs physically can't move. They'll be held in place. So then to attach these 2 together, I'm going to be putting some dados in this, and then I'm also going to be putting some shoulders on the pieces, so there's more of a glue joint to make it more structural. Sometimes for stuff like this, I've been switching over to doing dovetails. That's a little time consuming. I didn't think this base needed it, so I just decided to do dados, but I made them a little more structural by putting some shoulders on the cross members I'm putting in here. So you can see I just cut the center piece, and then I could set up a stop on the table saw and cut the 2 edges. They're set equidistant from the edge, so I could cut the 2 at the same time. And if you do it this way, when you go to put this together, it will square up for you because you're cutting them the same distance off the edge. So then I cut up all those 2x4s at the same time. So this is that material. I'm just cutting it into my cross members. This whole base was about 20 inches wide, I think. So that's the shoulder I'm adding just to make this joint a little more structural versus just a flat dado. And I'm doing that very simply by I kept the dado stack in my table saw from when I cut the dados. I have a stop set up, and you could see I could just cut those shoulders. You set it to the right height. I always do test pieces on stuff like this, and once I get it right, I could run all of my pieces through. There's always a little bit of cleanup to do on stuff like this because it is dimensional lumber. I didn't joint it or plane it, so sometimes you have to chisel away a little bit, but in general it works really well, and that is what the base looks like, all dry fit together. So then to glue up the base, pretty self-explanatory. The lap joints all get glued. Joints become much more structural the more surface area that has glue, because glue itself is going to be stronger than the wood. If you've ever broken a joint apart, most of the time the lumber fibers will still be connected. The glue will still be connected. It's the lumber that splinters first. So you can see I usually don't bother with using little pieces of protective wood when I'm clamping things, but because this is pine, it's going to be a lot softer than something like oak. So I use some little protected pieces under my clamps to not mar anything up. I could slide this all into place, clamp this all together, and let this whole piece set up. So there's just adding some clamps while this dries. And then at this point, I believe I glued up the cabinet as well as the base on the exact same day. And then I was able to put the cabinet on top of the base and then shoot the customer a photo. So then to finish up the wine bottle holders, I already had all these pieces cut, so I'm just gluing them into place. The glue is enough to hold these, but I don't have enough clamps. So what I did was I added glue, and then I added a bunch of brads into here just to hold them in place. You're not going to see most of this because it's going to be covered in wine. I do end up filling the brad holes, but putting hardware in here, it's not really going to be super noticeable. The brads I have in here are a little bit longer than the poplar, so you can see I'm doing 2 sides at once because it does go through the middle a little bit. And then that is what those look like slid into place. I'm using undermount drawer slides for the drawer boxes. I prefer those over side mounts. I started using them about a year ago, and unless someone specifically wants side mounts or the project calls for it because the drawer box is really wide or whatever it might be, I prefer to use undermounts. I think they have more wiggle room than side mounts, and also once you get past the learning curve of them, I find that they are easier to install personally and look better. So this is just roughing out all the parts for the drawer box. The part of the learning curve of those undermounts is there's a lot of measurement requirements for your drawer box. So you have to subtract about 1 inch of material off of your opening. That's another time I might not use the undermounts, as you do lose a lot of height using them. Then I'm using a jig for cutting all the dovetails. This is a yard sale find, and it's a knockoff Harbor Freight jig. It works great when you dial it in, but it can be a pain to get it dialed in. But once you do, it works really well. But you can see I have the instructions laying out because I had to make some changes to it in order to get these cuts perfect. So this is a time saver, but it can also, these can be very frustrating. I'm sure the name brand ones work a little bit better, but I prefer doing dovetails on all of my drawer fronts, and I do dados in the back. It's just a preference. So then I could add the groove. Once again, with the undermounts, the groove on these has to be a 1/2 inch up off the bottom of the box. It's a little bit higher than I used to make. So I'm doing one groove. The bottom of the box is getting a 1/4 inch piece of ply, but it's not exactly a quarter. So I'm cutting an 1/8 inch curve first, and then I'll move the fence a little bit in order to get the exact thickness I need. The back of these, I'm putting a rabbet, and like I said, I only put a rabbet in the back. The main force on your drawer when you pull them open is on the front, which is why you'll commonly see people do dovetails on the front and then dados in the back, because you just don't need the structure in the back of the drawer box. And then once that's done, I could cut the plywood I have down to size and slide it into those boxes. And these are obviously the same size. Then I could clamp them in place, square them up, and then measure to cut for that backer. If you don't do it this way, sometimes that backer's not exactly the measurement it should be. When your two diagonals are the exact same measurement, that means that your box is square. And this works on any sort of square or rectangular shape. So I don't think I filmed gluing these up because I'm now adding the hardware, but I add the hardware. There's all sorts of jigs they sell for these. I have found I do not need them. I just use a countersinking bit to make my pilot hole, and then I can attach the clips. And then for the backer, there's a jig as well, but I don't have that. And then I veneer the top edge of these. I don't film a ton of this. Veneering is extremely boring to do, and I find it extremely boring to watch. It's pretty self-explanatory. I have an iron veneer, and it's a slow process of just attaching all of this glue-on veneer. So then, like I said, for the backer, they make a jig for this, but what I do is I just take the slide and I put it in place, and if you push it down a little bit, it leaves an impression on the back there, and then that is the hole that you drill. I think it's a 5/16 inch bit, I believe, is in the back, and then I could add those drawers, but that will be in the third video. This side's getting an adjustable shelf, so for doing that, I just use a scrap piece of pegboard to drill all those holes. I cut the shelf to size, and I've misplaced my shelf pin, so I only have 2 in there, which is why this is teeter-tottering, but I cut the shelf to place, I veneer the edges, and then that is what that looks like.